Thanks, Gary, for being here with us today. We just want to ask you a few questions, and we can start out with what is your advice or recommendations for storage in tropical countries like Southeast Asia that is hot and humid?
Okay, well, I've spent all of my career in manufacturing facilities in the U.S. and really certainly not an expert on hot and humid environments, but heat and humidity can certainly affect the product, the premixes. It can affect the flowability and shelf life of some of the products. Humidity is probably going to be the major factor that you'll need to consider, but it's always a really good idea to store these types of ingredients in a cool, dry location. Most of the products are going to have storage recommendations on the package, but if you've got some specific concerns on products and you don't see good storage recommendations on the package, you can always call the manufacturer and they can give you some guidelines as well. But it's a good idea to do that because some of the products are going to be more sensitive to heat and humidity than others. So it's a good idea to try to figure out exactly what you need to think about and worry about for each product. But heat and humidity is going to will affect the flowability and shelf life.
Great, thanks for those recommendations, Gary. We also have another question for some recommendations based on producing premix in relation to equipment for premixing, quantity to be added to main vertical mixer.
So you mentioned vertical mixer, and I'm going to assume this is probably on farm equipment. You don't see a lot of vertical mixers in modern feed mills any longer, but as far as farm mixing, again, I'm not an expert in this area, but I can give you some guidelines. These type of mixers are typically not designed to do a really good job on dispersing low inclusion ingredients across a large batch. They batch, but they do a fairly good job. But so my recommendation for on-farm mixing in one of these vertical type mixers would be to use a pre-manufactured premix where your vitamins and minerals and other low inclusion ingredients are all packaged together and into a packaged premix that you could dump into your larger batch and it batch at least at a 2.5 to 5% of the total batch. 10% would even be better, would be optimum. But you want to have a premix that you can dump a larger amount into that larger batch. But one of the things that I would recommend, contact that equipment manufacturer. They're going to be able to give you the best guidelines on the capability of their mixer. I also recommend occasionally assaying your mix and just to make sure that you're getting a good homogeneous mix and that you're getting the results that you expect that you're going to feed on the farm. And keep a watch on the wear and tear of that piece of equipment as well. As the mixer wears, it won't do as good a job mixing.
Great, and after we get that premix, should the room for storing and producing premix be air conditioned as Southeast Asia is hot and humid tropics?
Certainly would be a great idea. In these tropical climates, heat and humidity are going to be some things that you need to think about. If it's practical to store those in an air conditioned room, I would certainly do that. A lot of times that may not be practical. As I said before, humidity is going to be more of an issue for you probably than heat. Typically, if you can keep the relative humidity below 75 or 80%, you should be okay. And with most premixes stored up to 30 days. So that would be my goal. If you can't put it in an air conditioned room and you've got a problem with the humidity, then maybe look at purchasing a dehumidifier to put in the room where you're storing it out. That will achieve the same goal.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gary. Our next question is focused on premix versus modern mix. And should we make a premix prior to be added in the mixer although modern mixer is able to mix very well?
Yeah, it's kind of a similar question to the first one, I guess. I'm assuming you're still talking about the on-farm mixers and whether you should either purchase or try to make a pre-mix to go into those vertical mixers. And it's certainly a great idea. Again, those type mixers are very good for what they're designed to do, but they're, one of the things most of them aren't designed to do well is disperse those low inclusion ingredients over a large batch. They're designed for speed and mixing of large inclusion rate ingredients, and so they don't typically do a great job. Again, my general rule of thumb would be any ingredient that you add to an on-farm vertical mixer, if you could keep it at 2.5 to 5% minimum of the total batch weight. And again, 10% would even be better if you could, if you've got a 3-ton mixer, 6,000 pounds, and if you could add in, 50 or 60 pound bags rather than just trying to drop in, 5 or 10 pounds of an ingredient and then expecting that to be dispersed over that entire batch, you'd be much better off.
Okay. Can we just add micro ingredients directly to the main mixer?
Yeah, so you mentioned micro ingredients, and I'm going to assume now we're shifting to more of a question from a feed manufacturing facility, a commercial feed manufacturing facility. And most of these are going to have, most modern feed mills are going to have a horizontal mixer. These mixers are designed to, they're very efficient. They do an excellent job of really taking those small inclusion rate ingredients and dispersing them very well over the large batches. And most feed mills will either dump those small inclusion ingredients directly into the mixer or through a hand add chute, or they'll use a micro system, and both systems do the same thing. The micro system does it automatically, so you got some automatic weighing, and it's good for speed. But either way is perfectly fine. And again, these vertical or horizontal mixers are capable of achieving that homogeneous mix and spreading those low inclusion ingredients very well across the batch, as long as it's used correctly and the mix time is correct.
So after we've had all the ingredients, added all the ingredients, what is the best method to flush or clean up mixer to reduce carryover or contamination in the feed mill?
Most common method of clearing your mixing system to prevent carryover, and that's the goal, prevent carryover, any kind of a contamination or harmful carryover into the following feed. But the most common method is to use sequencing, and sequencing is defined as a pre-planned production order of production of different feeds designed to direct any kind of carryover that you might get into a batch of feed that it's not going to be harmful. So you're going to look at different species of animals, different physiological stages of the animals, so that you make sure any kind of carryover of any ingredient is not going to be harmful in that next batch of feed. So you sequence it or pre-order your production so that you can accomplish that. And that's the most common method that's used in feed mills. Works very well. You do want to test that out, make sure that you whatever procedures that you put in place as far as sequencing, you want to make sure they actually work. So if you're trying to limit carryover of a certain ingredient into a following batch, or 3 batches later, or 2 batches later, whatever your guidelines are, it's a good idea to do some sampling and testing for that to make sure that your procedures that you put in place actually work. So it's good to do that. And the next best method, if you can't sequence and handle your and take care of your carryover concerns, and flushing. Flushing's defined as it involves taking a known ingredient, typically a ground grain or something like that, and moving a certain amount of it through your system. and allowing that to pick up anything that would be hanging around in that mixer and flushing it on out. Typically, you want to use about 5 to 10% of your mixer capacity when you flush an ingredient, and you run that through, and then once it goes all the way through the system, you'll gather it, and typically that's going to be discarded. The last method, which is not really common, is a breakdown and physical cleaning of the equipment, where you actually go down inside the mixer, clean and scrape and sweep and blow out whatever you need to do to get any kind of carryover out of any carryover of any ingredient out of there. That way, that works very well, but it's very time consuming and expensive. But those are the three methods. The most common is to utilize sequencing.
Thanks, Gary. We can move on to our last question from our feed mills. How do you measure homogeneity in mixing for additional small quantity of feed additives, say only 50 to 200 grams per ton?
So the most common method of measuring your mixer's ability to produce a good homogeneous mix is to calculate the coefficient of variation after performing a proper mixer test. And the test, it typically involves gathering at least a set of at least 10 samples of one batch of feed in the mixer, and you want to be very careful that you gather those samples in a proper way so that they're very representative of that batch of feed. The most common method is to gather those samples as that feed's exiting the mixer, and you do it on a timed basis, timed intervals, to make sure that you're getting a sample every so often, and that you would get at least 10 or more. And then the other thing that you want to be sure you do is pick a proper indicator to test for, to assay for. The most common one's salt. Salt assays are very accurate. Salt's usually a low inclusion rate, and it's in almost all feeds, and so that makes a good indicator to test for. And then the coefficient of variation is expressed as a percentage, and it's generally it's defined as a ratio of the standard deviation to the mean or the average. Our industry generally recognizes a CV of 10% or less as sufficient, but most modern mixers are capable of achieving CVs of around 5% or even better than that. So my guideline is, I like to see a CV of a mixer in the range of 5 to 10%, as close to 5% or below as you can get. It's a really good idea to conduct a mixer test and calculate your CV on a regular basis. Wear and tear of that mixer is going to affect its ability to continue to produce that homogeneous mix. And so you want to test it often, at least on an annual basis, and chart that, and you'll probably notice over time that your CV may begin to go down a little bit, and that may give you a good indication when you need to replace ribbons or paddles or do different types of maintenance on your mixer to get that CV back in an acceptable range.
Great. Thanks, Gary. I appreciate your time and recommendations here today. Just to close us out, do you have any closing comments you'd like to leave our listeners?
I guess the thing that you want to pay the most attention to is your equipment that you use to manufacture feed. Make sure that it's maintained properly. Maintenance is your number one quality tool, and wear and tear of that equipment over time will cause issues in your manufacturing, especially when you're trying to take these small premixes, small inclusion rate premixes, and disperse them over the batch and have a good homogeneous mix. You got to make sure you got to have good equipment to be able to do that, and maintaining those mixers is going to be critical in being able to do that.